He was a man who commanded empires with a single nod, a phantom the FBI spent a decade chasing to no avail. But standing in the sterile fluorescent glare of a hospital hallway, Matteo Visconti was completely paralyzed, not by a bullet, but by a terrified nurse's trembling whisper. The rain over Manhattan was relentless, slicking the streets into dark mirrors that reflected the neon bleed of the city. Inside the private dining room of Le Bernardin, the atmosphere was climate-controlled, scentless, and suffocatingly tense. Matteo Visconti sat at the head of the mahogany table, swirling a glass of Macallan 25. At 34, he was the undisputed head of the Visconti crime family, a syndicate whose tendrils reached deep into the ports of New York and the union halls of Chicago. He was known on the streets as Il Ghiaccio, the ice. He didn't scream, he didn't threaten, and he never, ever left a mess. Across from him sat Yuri Volkov, a Russian Bratva captain who was currently sweating through his custom Brioni suit. Matteo hadn't said a word in 5 minutes. He didn't need to. The silence was doing the work for him. Just as Yuri opened his mouth to concede the shipping routes, Matteo's burner phone vibrated against the table. Only one person had that number. Matteo held up a single leather-gloved finger. Yuri snapped his mouth shut. "Speak," Matteo answered, bringing the phone to his ear. "Boss," came the gravelly voice of Vincent Corallo, his underboss and oldest friend. Vincent didn't get rattled. He had survived 2 cartel wars and a federal indictment without losing his temper. But tonight, his voice was thin, almost hollow. There was a complication upstate. The Dante Greco hit. Matteo's jaw tightened. Dante was supposed to be breathing his last in a ditch off the Taconic State Parkway. Did you miss? No, Dante's dead. We ran his armoured SUV off the road near Poughkeepsie. But, boss, there was collateral. Another car got clipped in the pursuit. It rolled down the embankment. Clean it up, Vinny. Pay the local precinct, bury the civilian, and burn the wreckage. Why are you calling me with this? Because you need to come to Vassar Brothers Medical Center right now, Vincent insisted, his breathing jagged over the line. I secured the ICU floor. I paid off the attending surgeon. But, boss, I swear to God, I'm looking through the glass of room 314 and I don't believe what I'm seeing. You have to come. Who is it? Matteo demanded, his voice dropping an octave, freezing the air in the dining room. It's her, Matteo. Vincent never used his first name. It's Sienna. The glass of Macallan slipped from Matteo's fingers, shattering against the imported hardwood floor. Amber liquid pooled around his polished Oxfords. Yuri flinched, but Matteo didn't even notice the Russian anymore. Sienna Clark was dead. She had been dead for exactly 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days. She was the only civilian Matteo had ever let into his dark, blood-soaked world. She had been an art restorer, all paint-stained overalls and fiery defiance, completely unimpressed by his wealth or his shadows. He had loved her with a desperate, consuming violence, and because of that love, his rivals, the Greco family, had put a bomb in her Mercedes. Matteo had watched the car burn on a bridge in Brooklyn. He had buried an empty casket. He had spent the next 4 years systematically dismantling the Grecos, turning their operations to ash and their soldiers to corpses, culminating in tonight's hit on Dante, the last surviving capo. If this is a sick joke, Vinny, I will skin you alive, Matteo breathed, his chest suddenly tight, his vision tunneling. I'm looking right at a ghost, boss. Get here. 80 minutes later, Matteo's armoured Maybach tore into the ambulance bay of Vassar Brothers Medical Center in Poughkeepsie. He moved like a localized hurricane, flanked by 4 heavily armed soldiers in tailored suits. The hospital staff parted instantly, feeling the kinetic, lethal energy radiating from the men. Vincent was waiting by the elevators on the 3rd floor. He looked pale, nervously gripping the handle of a suppressed Glock inside his coat pocket. "Where?" Matteo demanded, grabbing Vincent by the lapels and slamming him against the wall. "Room 314, Vincent choked out, pointing down the hall. "She has a concussion, a few broken ribs from the airbag. The doctors say she's stable, but she's sedated." Matteo let him go and stalked down the linoleum hallway. His heart, an organ he assumed had stopped beating 4 years ago, was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He stopped in front of the heavy glass door of the ICU room. He pushed it open. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. Lying on the stark white bed, amidst a tangle of IV lines and sensor wires, was Sienna. Matteo stopped breathing. He gripped the edge of the metal bed rail so hard his knuckles turned white. It wasn't a look-alike. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was her. There was the tiny crescent-shaped scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood bicycle accident. There was the constellation of faint freckles across her nose. Her hair, once a vibrant chestnut, was dyed a dull, mousy blonde, and she looked thinner, exhausted. But it was unmistakably the woman who had owned his soul. He reached out, his hand shaking violently, and brushed the back of his knuckles against her cheek. She was warm. She was real. How? He whispered into the empty room, a terrifying mixture of overwhelming relief and violent rage boiling in his veins. Why didn't you come back to me? Why did you let me think you were Ash? If she had survived the blast, she would have come to him. She knew his power. She knew he would have leveled cities to keep her safe. Unless she hadn't been running from the Grecos. Unless she had been running from him. Matteo paced the length of the private ECU room like a caged apex predator. Outside the door, his men stood like stone gargoyles, ensuring no doctors or local police came within 50 feet without Vincent's express permission. The betrayal tasted like copper in his mouth. For 4 years he had been a hollowed-out shell, existing only for vengeance. He had butchered his way to the absolute top of the American Mafia hierarchy in her name, and all this time she had been hiding. Living a quiet life in upstate New York, driving a modest sedan, dyeing her beautiful hair to blend in. Who helped her? Matteo's mind raced, pulling at the threads of his empire. Someone powerful had to have staged the car bombing. Someone with enough resources to fake her death perfectly, fool the NYPD, fool the coroners, and fool Matteo's own vast intelligence network. The heavy door clicked open. Matteo spun around, his hand instinctively dropping to the 9mm holstered at his waist. A young nurse, wearing teal scrubs and a badge that read Joanne Higgins, stood frozen in the doorway. She was clutching a plastic clipboard against her chest like a shield. Her eyes darted from the hulking men outside the door to Matteo, instantly recognizing the aura of authority and danger. I need to check her vitals, Joanne stammered, her voice barely louder than the hum of the heart monitor. And check the IV drip. Matteo stared at her for a long second before stepping back, granting her access to the bed. Do your job. But if you speak a word of who is in this room to anyone, I will ensure you never work in medicine or anywhere else again. Do we understand each other, Joanne? The nurse swallowed hard and nodded, hurriedly moving to Sienna's side. She checked the monitor, adjusted the saline drip, and carefully noted the blood pressure. Her hands were shaking. Will she wake up soon? Matteo asked, his voice softer now, his eyes fixed on Sienna's pale face. The sedation is wearing off, Joanne replied nervously. She suffered blunt force trauma to the chest and head, but there's no internal bleeding. She's incredibly lucky. When the EMTs brought her in, she was fighting them off, terrified. We had to sedate her just to get her into the MRI machine. Terrified of what? She wouldn't say. She wouldn't let us look for an ID, wouldn't let us call anyone. She just kept thrashing and crying out for the boy. Matteo frowned, stepping closer. What boy? Joanne stopped writing. She looked at Matteo, confusion warring with her fear. Her son. He was in the back seat in a booster chair when her car went off the embankment. Didn't your men tell you? The silence in the room became absolute, a suffocating vacuum. Matteo felt the floor tilt beneath his expensive shoes. Son, he repeated, the word completely alien on his tongue. Yes, Joanne said, pointing a trembling finger toward the observation window that looked out into a secondary triage room across the hall. Child services is on their way, but for now, we put him in there. He's unharmed, just bruised and a little shaken up. Matteo turned slowly. Through the double panes of soundproof glass, he looked into the brightly lit pediatric triage room. Sitting on the edge of an examination table, swinging his small legs, was a little boy. He couldn't have been more than 3.5, maybe 4 years old. He had messy, dark hair, and he was fiercely clutching a cheap blue stuffed elephant. Matteo's boots felt like they were made of lead as he walked toward the window. He pressed his hand flat against the glass. The boy looked up. Even from 20 feet away, through the glass, it hit Matteo with the force of a freight train. The shape of the boy's jaw, the unruly wave of his dark hair, and the eyes. Nurse Joanne had followed Matteo to the window, misinterpreting his silence as standard familial concern. She looked from the child in the room back to the tall, imposing Mafia boss standing beside her. "His eyes look exactly like yours," the nurse whispered. The Mafia boss stopped breathing. They were a piercing, icy cobalt blue, a rare, striking genetic marker that had been in the Visconti bloodline for 5 generations. It was a gaze that hardened men feared, a gaze that ordered executions and burned down empires. But looking back at him from the face of this innocent child, it was wide, curious, and undeniable. Matteo stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of sterile instruments. The clatter was deafening, but he barely heard it. The math in his head was terrifyingly simple. 4 years, 2 months since Sienna died, 9 months of pregnancy. The child was exactly the right age. He had a son. All the air rushed back into Matteo's lungs in a violent heave. The puzzle pieces were slamming together, forming a picture so ugly and treacherous it made his vision go red. Sienna didn't run because she fell out of love. She didn't run from the Grecos. She ran to protect their child. But from whom? Matteo shoved past the nurse and pushed through the door into the hallway. Vincent snapped to attention. "Vinny, cancel the perimeter," Matteo ordered, his voice a low, terrifying growl that Vincent had only heard once before, the night Matteo took over the family in a bloodbath. "Get the armoured cars pulled up to the service elevator. We're taking her and the boy to the private clinic in Manhattan. Now." "Boss, the doctor said she shouldn't be moved." "I don't care what they said," Matteo roared, grabbing Vincent by the throat and slamming him against the wall again, this time lifting the older man off his feet. "Someone inside my house did this. Someone in my family tried to murder my pregnant wife 4 years ago, and whoever they used to fake her death is going to realize they missed tonight." Vincent's eyes widened in sheer panic as he choked out, "Wife? Boss? The boy?" Matteo dropped him. He turned and strode across the hall, pushing open the door to the triage room. The little boy flinched, pulling the stuffed elephant tighter against his chest. He looked up at the giant, terrifying man dressed in a blood-spattered suit. Matteo dropped to one knee, ignoring the pain of the hard floor, bringing himself eye-level with his blood. His son. Up close, the resemblance was even more staggering. It was like looking into a time machine. "Hey," Matteo said, forcing his voice to be softer than it had been in a decade. "What's your name, little one?" The boy stared at him with those icy Visconti eyes. He didn't cry, he didn't cower. The bloodline was strong in him. "Leo," the boy said, his voice a tiny, brave squeak. "Are you the bad men my mummy told me about?" Matteo felt a physical pain in his chest, a jagged knife twisting in his ribs. "No, Leo, I'm a friend." "Who did your mummy tell you the bad men were?" Leo looked nervously toward the door, as if expecting monsters to pour in. "Mommy said we always have to hide, because the man with the silver cane wants to hurt us." Matteo froze. The temperature in the room plummeted. The world outside the hospital ceased to exist. The man with the silver cane, it wasn't a rival boss, it wasn't the police. It was his uncle, Arthur Visconti, the patriarch of the family, the man who had held Matteo while he wept at Sienna's empty grave, the man who had counselled him, guided him, and helped him consolidate power over the last 4 years. Arthur had ordered the hit to protect the purity and focus of the syndicate, knowing a civilian wife and child would make Matteo weak, Arthur had built Matteo's throne on the ashes of his family. Matteo stood up slowly. The grief and shock that had paralyzed him moments ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, apocalyptic fury. He looked at Leo, a vow silently sealing itself in blood. "You don't have to hide anymore, Leo," Matteo whispered, pulling his phone from his pocket and dialing the number for his personal tactical strike team. "Because I'm going to kill every single monster in this world." The extraction was a masterclass in organized violence. Within 10 minutes, Matteo's tactical team, 6 men dressed in unmarked black tactical gear, carrying suppressed submachine guns, swept the ICU floor. They moved Sienna, still unconscious and hooked to a portable monitor, onto a specialized stretcher. Leo was carried in the arms of Vincent, the little boy's face buried in the underboss's shoulder, shielded from the terrifying efficiency of the men around him. As the heavy service elevator doors opened to the underground parking garage, the sterile smell of the hospital was replaced by the harsh tang of exhaust and wet concrete. 2 armoured Mercedes Sprinter vans idled, their blacked-out windows giving nothing away. But Matteo's instincts, honed by a lifetime of paranoia, flared. "Hold," Matteo commanded, his hand shooting out to stop the stretcher. At the far end of the garage, a dark grey SUV with its headlights off was creeping toward the exit ramp. It wasn't the police. Cops drove with a distinct rhythm, a predictable arrogance. This vehicle moved like a predator sliding through tall grass. "Vinny, get the boy in the second van," Matteo ordered, drawing his 9mm from his shoulder holster. "Bravo team, secure my wife. Alpha, with me." The grey SUV suddenly accelerated, its tyres screeching against the painted concrete, hurtling directly toward the loading zone. They hadn't come to investigate, they'd come to finish the job from 4 years ago, Arthur's cleaners. "Light them up," Matteo roared. The underground garage erupted into deafening chaos. Muzzle flashes strobed like violent lightning. Matteo's men opened fire, a concentrated barrage of high-velocity rounds that shattered the SUV's windshield and ripped through its radiator. The heavy vehicle swerved, slamming violently into a concrete pillar with a sickening crunch of metal. Silence slammed back down, punctuated only by the hissing of the ruined engine and the drip of fluids. Matteo didn't wait. He stalked toward the wrecked SUV, his weapon raised, his icy blue eyes fixed on the driver's side. The driver was slumped over the wheel, dead. But the passenger door kicked open, and a man stumbled out clutching an assault rifle. It was Dominic Costa, one of Arthur's most trusted lieutenants. Dominic looked up, coughing blood, his eyes widening as he recognized the towering, furious figure of his boss walking out of the shadows. "Matteo? Wait!" Bang! Matteo didn't hesitate. He put a single round through Dominic's kneecap, dropping the man to the oil-stained floor. Dominic screamed, dropping his rifle. Matteo stood over him, stepping heavily onto the shattered knee. "Did my uncle send you?" he asked, his voice a chilling monotone that echoed through the empty garage. He said it was unfinished business," Dominic gasped, weeping from the agony. "He said the Dante hit exposed a loose end." "The only loose end is Arthur," Matteo whispered. He raised his weapon and finished it. Turning his back on the carnage, Matteo walked to the primary van and climbed into the back. Sienna was secured, her pale face illuminated by the soft amber glow of the medical equipment. Beside her, Leo was buckled into a leather captain's chair, his small hands still gripping the stuffed elephant. He looked at Matteo, his wide cobalt eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and awe. "Drive," Matteo ordered the driver. "Take us to the Astor penthouse. No one goes in or out. The entire building is on lockdown." The private medical suite inside Matteo's secure Manhattan penthouse hummed with quiet efficiency. It was a gilded cage, perched 80 stories above the glittering grid of New York City. The storm had passed, leaving the skyline washed clean and sparkling in the early morning light. Matteo sat in a velvet armchair beside the bed, his suit jacket discarded, his tie loosened. His knuckles were bruised, and his hands were stained with gunpowder and dried blood, but he hadn't moved for 6 hours. A soft groan broke the silence. Matteo leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sienna's eyelashes fluttered. Her breathing hitched as the dull ache of her injuries registered, but then her eyes snapped open. Panic instantly flooded her features. She tried to sit up, her hands scrambling for the IV lines. "Leo, where is my son? Don't touch him," she screamed, her voice hoarse and desperate. "Sienna!" The single word cut through her panic. She froze, turning her head slowly. When her gaze locked onto Matteo, all the colour drained from her face. She looked at him as if he were a ghost, or the devil himself. She pressed herself back against the headboard, pulling the crisp white sheets to her chest. "Where is my son?" she demanded, her voice trembling but laced with a fierce maternal steel. "If you hurt him, Matteo, I swear to God—" "He is safe," Matteo said softly, raising his hands in surrender. "He's asleep in the next room. Vinny is sitting outside his door. No one will ever hurt him." Sienna let out a fractured sob, her defences crumbling. But the fear remained in her eyes. "Why am I here? Are you going to finish what Arthur started?" Matteo closed his eyes, a profound, agonizing grief washing over him. "You thought I knew," he whispered, the realization heavier than any bullet he had ever taken. "For 4 years, you thought I ordered the bomb." "Arthur told me," Sienna cried, tears spilling over her pale cheeks. "After the explosion, I crawled out of the wreckage before the flames hit the gas tank. I was bleeding, terrified. I hid in the alley. I saw Arthur's men arrive. I heard them talking. They said you gave the order. They said the boss didn't want a civilian wife dragging down the syndicate." "And you believed them?" Matteo asked, his voice breaking. "I didn't want to, but who else could bypass your security, Matteo? Who else knew the exact route I was taking that night?" Sienna wiped her face angrily. "Then I found out I was pregnant. I couldn't risk Leo. I couldn't risk finding out if the man I loved had turned into a monster. So I ran. I became a ghost." Matteo stood up slowly. He walked to the edge of the bed and dropped to his knees. The undisputed king of the New York underworld, a man who bowed to no one, knelt on the floor before the woman he loved. "I buried an empty box, Sienna," Matteo whispered, tears pooling in his icy eyes for the first time since that terrible night. "I tore this city apart brick by brick, looking for the people who took you from me. I slaughtered the Grecos because I thought they did it. I died that night on the bridge with you. If I had known, if I had even suspected Arthur." Sienna looked down at him, searching his face. She knew the monster he could be to the world, but she also knew the man he was with her. The absolute shattering truth in his eyes was undeniable. The ice had melted, leaving only raw, bleeding devotion. Slowly, her trembling hand reached out and rested on his dark hair. "Matteo!" He buried his face in her hands, inhaling the scent of her skin, letting the reality of her survival anchor him back to the earth. "I will never let you go again," he vowed into her palms, "and I will bring you Arthur's head." The Union League Club on Park Avenue was a bastion of old money and quiet power. Leather-bound books lined the walls, and the scent of expensive cigars hung heavy in the air. Arthur Visconti sat in a private corner booth, elegantly dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit, his silver-headed cane resting against the mahogany table. At 65, he was a silver fox, radiating aristocratic authority. He was sipping a glass of port when the heavy oak doors of the reading room slammed shut, the heavy deadbolts clicking into place with a loud echo. Arthur looked up, his eyes narrowing. The 4 private security guards he had stationed outside were gone. Instead, Matteo stood at the entrance, flanked by Vincent and 2 heavily armed enforcers. Matteo looked immaculate, a fresh suit hugging his broad shoulders, his face an unreadable mask of pure, freezing calm. Il Ghiaccio had returned. "Matteo," Arthur said smoothly, though a flicker of unease crossed his features. "What is the meaning of this disruption? We had a council meeting scheduled for tomorrow." Matteo walked slowly across the Persian rug. He didn't yell. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply pulled out the chair across from his uncle and sat down. "Dominic Costa is dead," Matteo stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "He had a terrible accident in a hospital parking garage upstate. Arthur's hand tightened imperceptibly on his glass. That is unfortunate. Dominic was a capable soldier. He was an assassin, Matteo corrected, leaning forward, his cobalt eyes locking onto Arthur's. Sent to kill a ghost. Tell me, uncle, when you planted the bomb in Sienna's car, did you know she was pregnant? The silence in the room was absolute. Arthur didn't feign ignorance. He was too smart and he knew Matteo too well. If Matteo was here, asking this question, he already had the proof. Arthur sighed, carefully setting his glass down. I did what was necessary, Matteo. You were weak. You were obsessed with that girl. A Don cannot have a civilian whispering in his ear, softening his resolve. I built this empire, and I wasn't going to let a pretty art restorer tear it down. You built nothing, Matteo said softly. You hid in the shadows while my father bled, and then you hid behind me while I conquered our enemies. You killed my wife, or thought you did. You hunted my son. Your son? Arthur's eyes widened slightly, genuine surprise piercing his calm facade. Leo, Matteo said, tasting the name, letting it fuel the dark fire in his chest. He has my eyes, Arthur. He has the Visconti blood, the blood you tried to spill on a highway. Arthur reached slowly toward his silver cane. Matteo, be reasonable. I am your family. I am your blood. We can move past this. The boy can be raised right, within the family. Before Arthur's fingers could graze the handle of the cane, which concealed a razor-sharp sword, Matteo moved with terrifying speed. He grabbed Arthur's wrist, twisting it violently until a loud snap echoed through the room. Arthur shouted in pain, dropping the cane to the floor. Matteo stood, pulling a suppressed pistol from his jacket. You are not my family, Matteo whispered, pointing the barrel directly at Arthur's forehead. My family is waiting for me at home. Bang! The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Astor penthouse, painting the hardwood floors in strokes of gold. The city below was awake, unaware of the tectonic shift that had just occurred in its underworld. Matteo stood by the glass, watching the traffic far below. The war was over. The empire was his, absolutely and unchallenged. But for the first time in his life, the power didn't matter. He heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned to see Sienna standing in the doorway. She was wearing one of his oversized dress shirts, looking exhausted but beautiful. Standing next to her, clutching her leg with one hand and his blue elephant with the other, was Leo. Matteo knelt, opening his arms. Leo looked at his mother. Sienna gave the boy a gentle, reassuring nod. Tentatively, the little boy walked across the sunlit floor and stepped into Matteo's embrace. Matteo closed his eyes, wrapping his arms around his son, feeling the tiny, steady heartbeat against his chest. Sienna walked over, sinking to her knees beside them, and wrapped her arms around them both. The ice was gone. In its place was a man who would burn the world down to keep his family warm, a king who had finally found his queen and his heir. The ghosts of the past were buried, and the future belonged entirely to the Viscontis. If this heart-pounding tale of betrayal, Mafia justice, and undeniable love kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit that like button. Share this story with your fellow romance and drama lovers, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired audio stories and immersive sagas. Drop a comment below telling us what you would have done in Matteo's shoes. See you next time.